I just heard you say, we shouldn't have done this. She would have told us what it is. That's what I just heard you say. Well, you haven't identified yourself, whoever you are. And what just happened was somebody just did this little psyop where I get an email addressed as Reclaim the Feminine that has pictures of women that may look kind of like me. You know, me. Their hair's a little blonder. And I'm supposed to forward it to myself from the other folder as a form of payment. Is that what you do? You take pictures of women that might meet a certain profile, use them for your payment scheme? Yeah. Kiss my ass. You guys spent 25 years using me for somebody else's payment and tried to give me some bullshit story that I owed on what turned out to be a completely illegal deal to begin with. And you're running around like a fucking jackass with your head up your ass, trying to fucking cover your ass. Right? You're trying to cover up for the fact that whatever you tried to sign up my life for was so fucking illegal that we get to where we were this morning. In May of 2018, after a young man by the name of Demetrius shot up his school in Texas, there was some news coverage discussing information about the alleged understanding concerning this incident. One of the things it discussed was that he had a proclivity for investigating or being associated with white supremacist websites. It talked about how he had, through Amazon, purchased a vest that had particular symbols on it, iconography that was associated with white supremacy. My concern was that for over a year, I had been occasionally finding what I understood to be intentionally orchestrated psychological operations in the form of taunts back encoded to the feeds on YouTube videos I was watching. I'd watched a video, and while I was watching it, there'd be something circulating or something going through the current in my head, in my thinking, and I'd be like, whoa, and I would look at the code, and they would have embedded in the code of the video taunts specifically engaged at me. This happened at least once that I got the information on, and twice that I caught as they were doing it. Now, both times that happened, I was in a steady state of mind. And so I was able to be lucid about it. I understood it was an attempt to try to terrorize me on some level. It didn't work. The evidence from those specific video feeds has been stolen. But I have the backing codes of other feeds, specifically from YouTube, where there's misinformation and insertions of particular kinds of program sequences in the video itself. And I've recognized that these kinds of programmatic sequences actually end up being reflected in the encounters I have with people. There are certain kinds of program terms that can actually have a biological impact on someone. I'll give you an example. The portly Hispanic man. Particular kind of Hispanic man, some might call a bear, kind of in the proportion of his body. Somehow he starts producing a certain kind of hormone that gives him a little extra punch. Right? And it's a specific kind of displacement or concentration of body mass in the midriff area. And there's a particular tone of voice that effectuates a specific register when he's speaking. I at least twice encountered embedded in the back-end code of YouTube videos what were phrases associated with a particular kind of body shape identification that had symbolic references that would have been associated with people demographically identified as Hispanic. I believe that what would be happening is these men, particular people, would be pinged or would be somehow attracted to a particular kind of site, thinking maybe they just had an interest in seeing something, and embedded in the back end code was actually something they would pick up on unconsciously, and it could actually effectuate an alteration of their body mass. It can effectuate a engagement with and manipulation of their hormone production, and it can actually change and alter the shape of their body just by what otherwise somebody might describe as a legitimate command prompt or command code in the back end coding of what would be a YouTube feed. Now, I have been trying to get attention paid to the fact that for years, pretty much every article I currently have online that's been published in my name is back encoded with things I would never have allowed to be associated with or coded into articles or publications that I submitted. For instance, there's one site that I've had been published with for going on 20 years now that at some point started embedding what appear to be crypto links connected to Twitter feeds. So there's like entire lines of what translates into, if you look it up, which I have, crypto feeds or Twitter account handles. And if you go through them, you can actually see what appears to be some kind of sequence that has specific kinds of ethnic and or demographic indicators, and more often than not, unfortunately, also involve sites that have people engaged in some sort of simulation as if they're a kid, or actually accounts involving minors and or pornography. And we're talking about articles that I've written on political topics for which there's actually no legitimate reason to have any link connected to something that's pornography or considered to be a sexualized erotic image. That's one. There's another one, a publication, where because of the way they've categorized the article, that in the back end coding of my articles on that site, there are strategic references at certain lines of code referencing the Ukraine and then uranium, in connection with articles I've had published specifically about water policy. The dates of publication on those articles happen to correlate with what I did not know at the time was a presidential announcement concerning the maritime trade and the maritime sector. I didn't know this at the time that I submitted those articles for publication. I also know that another article that I published in a paper publication was later put online and has been strategically misrepresented as having been published almost 15 years after it was actually published, and has been allowed to be put into a sequence where it is the center point between two articles on different racial groups, as if there is one racial group and then another racial group and then another racial group that's referenced in a chain concerning our, political issues associated with those that self-identify as LGBT, but that come from a cultural context that have a different perspective on the political merit of movements about identification around being LGBT. Now, this is just me. This is just me personally. And I have had a concern that what's been happening for several years is that article, those two articles actually, that I published about water policy that are back encoded with references to the Ukraine and to the uranium, are allowed to be pinged or triggered in order to try to ping me and elicit a particular kind of emotional outburst. That they actually ping something connected to uranium in the back end coding of that article and direct it to an electronic account running concerning my identity at the time. And they nuke me. They literally send a low level radioactive energy burst at me in order to excitate me into a feeling of intense rage or anger or excruciating physical pain that can, and often does, I'm not going to lie, compel me to yell out in some manner, in anger. And I actually believe, honestly, that is a form of weaponization connected to the development of plasma weaponry. That literally what they do is they take people like me and they make us some sort of remote activation in what is an unfolding plasma weapons paradigm. And to be honest with you, I think a lot of the containment centers and a lot of the alleged facilities that are being set up ostensibly to treat COVID-19 are just that. They are experimentation on the development of large-scale plasma weapons paradigms. Now, that's just me. At some point, another publication, where I used to be the copy editor, that's a bilingual publication, had in some way back encoded references to me that paired me with an article on a young man, I believe under the age of 21, who was identified as a white supremacist and was being called out for his white supremacist and racial hatred expressions. They actually included screenshots of his Twitter feeds as examples. But the thing is, again, even those Twitter feeds had metrics coded into them that were back encoded into that article that referenced mine. And my article was, again, about water policy and about an alternative concept of organizing in relationship to development of community responses and community governance around water policy issues. Now, all four of those publications I've talked about have a different back-end coding structure. They have a different slight positioning on the actual page and a different kind of pairing matching system. So if this is something that's being done remotely by Homeland Security or the CIA, then they've specifically designed it so that each of these publications has a different modality for basically back encoding my life and back encoding misrepresentations of what I have actually done as part of my work and what I have done in the public realm. The question I've been having, especially because I've had literally no response from anybody for such a protracted period of time, is, was this something that was orchestrated in connection with and with the cognizant consent and premeditation of people I used to consider to be colleagues? Did the people at these publications actually conspire to embed in the back-end code of their own websites acts of sabotage of my identity that actually effectuate a form of electronic torture of me and that are also connected to electronic warfare paradigms? Considering the fact that the public health department I used to work at has never responded to misrepresentations of data that's available online, including through at least one site that alleges to be an official site connected to a government body, regarding my qualifications as somebody that is certified or that is licensed, as identified as eligible to approve the certifications on people who can prescribe medications, right? There's a hard time I have feeling like there is not absolutely 100% a premeditated, state-sponsored, state-enacted paradigm to intentionally defame me in the back-end code and ignore me while misrepresentations of my life are allowed to circulate through an illicit economy, one that's connected to trafficking in radioactive materials, as well as acts of warfare in other countries, including countries that otherwise would be considered allies of the United States. I don't understand. This is inexplicable unless you really were trying to recruit me to be a terrorist. See, I understand at some point somebody identified that the appropriate placement for me and my skills and talents, and really the only option I was going to be given for any sort of political representation, was as a transgender person. And as a transgender person, I was identified as somebody that was supposed to be in a particular leadership role in promoting transgender rights and possibly perhaps also transgender rights for people with mental disabilities. That somebody had determined they were going to politically engineer my life, at least after 2005 or 6, to be somebody that was going to be only allowed to have a political identity associated with being transgender and or being a disability rights activist. The problem is, at some point, I came to an understanding politically that A, I do not consider myself politically gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender or queer anymore. I've been celibate for a protracted period of time, and my actual sexual conduct is different from my political stance. And since the LGBT movement decided to take on marriage as a political issue, I do not feel any political affinity with anything identified as LGBT or Q. I believe that marriage and the contract relationship that is marriage is not a civil right. It's a property right. And it's also a specific kind of property right connected to specifically a relationship between a man and a woman. And so to discuss marriage and marriage as a political right outside of the context of these specific property relations between conveyance concerning men and conveyance concerning women is a misrepresentation of it politically, and is also a devaluation of what are actual civil rights, but also negates the fact that I never associated with being LGBTQ because of property rights. I was against the concept of marriage and the property and private property at the time to begin with, and that forced compulsion into a monogamous relationship was counter-revolutionary. I've since changed my minds because the material conditions do not allow for an appropriate political expression of that political conviction. Just so you know. And in the same time, I believe that transgender rights have been a contrivance of the forced transhumanist agenda that refuses to acknowledge the role of cybernetic enhancements and the intercession of biophysiological processes with mechanized processes and processes of automation, including ones associated with the digital economy and or various kinds of wireless technologies that can interact with us, including our brain chemistry and brain structure biophysiologically without a intermediate such as a computer or even a cell phone. And until there is actual forthcomingness on that, and until there is an actual political will to expose what's really going on with the outroll of 5G, 4G, 3G, and the manipulation by and in conjunction with radio frequency, there is, to me, nothing about transgender rights that is a civil right. It is a different kind of struggle, and it's one that I personally do not align myself with. So somebody else's attempt to politically engineer me as some form of pioneer and leadership concerning transgender rights was misguided. Just so you know. And secondly, I never accepted and now understand precisely that I did not have a disability. I was not mentally ill. Was I incapacitated at the time because of a traumatic brain injury that was a result of being subjected to radio frequency manipulation as part of directed energy weapons testing? Yes, I do. Do I believe that I was retaliated against politically and was subjected to processes of human test subject experimentation as a part of the outroll of the digital economy? Yes, I do. Those are concerns regarding political rights, but they are not about me personally having a mental illness or having a disability, and it is disrespectful and an act of fraud against people who do actually have an illness or a mental illness or disability. So these are very important distinctions that I bring up, because then the question becomes, was I attempted for recruitment into acts of terrorism specifically based on an understanding of the demographic that was left if I did not allow for political engineering as disabled and or transgender? This brings up the next part.